Chapter 1. The War That Changed Everything. The Second World War had ended. It was 1945. The guns had fallen silent, and the bombs had stopped falling. The cities of Europe lay in ruins. Buildings were broken. Streets were empty. Families searched for food, for shelter, and for loved ones who were gone. The war was over, but peace felt far away. People tried to rebuild their lives. They wanted hope. They wanted a future. But in the shadows, something was changing. Two great powers had helped to win the war: the United States and the Soviet Union. At first, they worked together. They were allies. They fought against the same enemy. But when the war was over, they began to look at each other differently. The United States believed in freedom, in democracy, and in open markets. The Soviet Union believed in control, in communism, and in a strong central government. Their ideas were opposites. Europe became like a broken puzzle, split into pieces. In the West, countries were free. They could choose their leaders. They could make their own rules. The United States helped them recover. They sent money, food, and supplies. They wanted to stop hunger. They wanted to stop poverty. But in the East, it was different. The Soviet Union moved quickly. They stayed in the countries they had helped to liberate during the war: Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and more. They put communist governments in place. These countries had no choice. The Soviet Union called it protection. They said, "We need a buffer zone. We need safety." But people living there called it something else: control. Winston Churchill, the British leader, gave a speech. His voice was calm, but his words were sharp. "An iron curtain has fallen across Europe," he said. The world listened. The words "Iron Curtain" became famous. A curtain of ideas, a curtain of fear. The division of Europe had begun. The two great powers stood on opposite sides of this curtain. People started to feel it. Life was changing. Neighbors were turning against neighbors. In countries controlled by the Soviet Union, speaking the wrong words could be dangerous. "Is that person a spy?" they whispered. "Can I trust my friend?" Fear spread like smoke. Families whispered in their homes. Friends stopped talking. People learned to be careful with their words. But in the West, life was different. There was freedom to speak, to choose, to move. People in the West had more hope. They believed life would get better. But one thing was the same everywhere. People were afraid of war. This time, it was not a war of soldiers and tanks. It was something new. It was a war of ideas, a war of power, and maybe a war of bombs. The United States had a powerful secret. During the Second World War, they built the atomic bomb. A single bomb could destroy an entire city. 2 bombs had ended the war against Japan. Now the world knew that the U.S. had this terrible weapon. The Soviet Union was watching. They felt weak. They knew they had to catch up. Scientists worked day and night. And in 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. It worked. The world gasped. Everything changed. The United States and the Soviet Union started to build more bombs, bigger bombs, deadlier bombs. It was called the arms race. People around the world asked, why are they building so many bombs? Do they plan to use them? The leaders said no. They said, these bombs will keep us safe. It was a strange idea. If both sides had the power to destroy the world, then maybe no one would dare to start a war. But fear was everywhere. Schools in the United States started holding drills. When you hear the alarm, the teacher said, hide under your desk, cover your head. Duck and cover, they called it. Children followed the rules, but their faces showed the truth. They were scared. Everyone was scared. One mistake could mean disaster. It wasn't just Europe and the United States. The whole world was divided. Countries were asked to choose sides. Will you join the West or the East? The United States and the Soviet Union competed for friends. They sent money. They sent food. They sent weapons. They wanted to prove their way of life was better. Countries like China, India, and Korea became battlefields for ideas. Some people called it the fight for hearts and minds. And so, the Cold War began. It was called cold because there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. But it did not feel cold. It felt hot. There were battles in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. There were spies everywhere. Secrets were stolen. Leaders gave speeches. Promises were made. Threats were whispered. People waited. They waited for news. They waited for answers. Would there be war? Would there be peace? In small houses in Europe, families gathered around their radios. They listened for news. Today, there is tension, the announcer said. Today, there is hope. But no one knew what tomorrow would bring. Across the oceans, in the cities of the United States, people asked each other, why do they hate us? Why don't they want freedom? And in the Soviet Union, workers asked, why do they fear us? We only want safety. Misunderstandings grew. The two sides did not trust each other. Their leaders met, but their words were cold. Their smiles were fake. In public, they talked about peace. In private, they built weapons. They planned. They prepared. The Cold War shaped everything. Art, music, science. Even the sky became a battlefield. People looked up at the stars and dreamed. Who will win the race to space? They asked. The United States and the Soviet Union watched each other. They watched and waited. And in the hearts of ordinary people, there was one thought. We don't want war again. Please, never again. Mothers held their children close. Fathers looked at their empty fields. Young men dreamed of a future that felt far away. The Cold War had begun. It would last for almost 50 years. But no one knew that yet. For now, they only knew this. The world was no longer the same. Europe was divided. Families were divided. The world was divided. A curtain had fallen, and behind it, a new story was waiting to be told. Chapter 2: A Divided Europe. After the Second World War, Europe was broken. Cities were in ruins. People were hungry and tired. Families had lost their homes. Their lives would never be the same. Across the continent, people tried to rebuild, but it was not easy. There was hope for peace. There was hope for a better future. But instead, something strange happened. Europe split into two parts. The division was clear. In the West, countries were free. People could choose their leaders. They could speak their minds. The United States sent money and help to Western Europe through something called the Marshall Plan. Factories opened again. Shops filled with goods. People saw new possibilities. Life began to improve. But in the East, it was different. The Soviet Union stayed in control of the countries it had freed during the war. These countries were now communist. There were no free elections. People had to follow the rules of the Soviet government. They had no choice. The Soviet Union said they needed a buffer zone. They said, "We are protecting ourselves from future attacks." But the people there felt trapped. In countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, things changed quickly. Communist leaders came to power. The rules became strict. People could not speak against the government. If they did, they could be arrested. Or worse, soldiers were everywhere. Posters showed pictures of Soviet leaders, smiling. But the smiles were cold. Winston Churchill, the British leader, spoke to the world. His words were strong and clear. "An iron curtain has fallen across Europe," he said. It was not a real curtain. It was an invisible line. On one side was the West. On the other side was the East. The curtain was a symbol of division, a symbol of fear. People could feel the change. Families were divided. Friends were separated. A train could take you to the edge of the Iron Curtain, but no further. People looked across the border, wondering what life was like on the other side. They asked questions. Do people in the West have more food? Are they free to travel? Do they live better lives? In the West, people asked their own questions. Are people in the East safe? Are they happy? Do they want change? For many, there were no answers. The two sides did not talk to each other. Instead, they stared at each other, like opponents in a long game. But this was not a game. It was real. In the cities of Eastern Europe, life was hard. People worked in factories or on farms. The government controlled everything. They decided what people could buy. They decided what newspapers could print. Shops were often empty. Bread, sugar, and meat were hard to find. People waited in long lines, hoping for food. Some dreamed of escaping to the West, but that was dangerous. Guards watched the borders. Walls, fences, and soldiers made it nearly impossible to leave. In the West, life was different. There was more freedom, more choices. Factories grew stronger and businesses reopened. People could travel from country to country. They could vote for leaders they trusted. Western Europe became a place of opportunity, a place of hope. But there was also fear. People knew that war could start again. They watched the East and asked, what will happen next? The United States and the Soviet Union were not friends anymore. They competed for power. The West had its allies. The East had its own. Both sides wanted to prove they were stronger, smarter, and better. It was not a war with guns or tanks. It was a war of ideas. In Eastern Europe, children learned about the Soviet Union in school. The West is dangerous, their teachers said. The Soviet Union will keep you safe. In the West, it was the opposite. Schools taught children about freedom. Communism is a threat, they said. We must protect our way of life. The world became a place of us and them. People did not understand each other anymore. They were scared. They felt confused. How could two parts of the same continent be so different? In East Berlin, a boy named Stefan watched his father disappear into the night. His father had been talking about freedom too loudly. "Stay quiet," his mother said. "The walls have ears." Stefan didn't understand. "Whose ears?" he asked. His mother didn't answer. She only looked out the window, searching for shadows. In West Berlin, a girl named Anna watched her father open a newspaper. He read stories about life in the East. "They are suffering," he said. Anna asked, "Why can't we help them?" Her father shook his head. "It's not that simple." The Iron Curtain was more than a line on a map. It was in people's minds and hearts. It made them afraid of each other. It made them strangers. The world's leaders gave speeches. They made promises. They made threats. In Moscow, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, said, "We will defend our way of life." In Washington, President Truman said, "We must stop communism." The two sides watched each other closely. They waited for the other to make a mistake. In 1948, the first real crisis began. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was also divided. The western part of the city belonged to the United States, Britain, and France. The eastern part belonged to the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted all of Berlin under his control. One night, he gave the order. The roads to West Berlin were closed. No food, no supplies, nothing. The people of West Berlin were trapped. They were scared. "Will we starve?" they asked. The Western Allies made a decision. They would not give up. They would not let Stalin win. Planes began to fly over Berlin. They dropped food, milk, and coal for the people. Day and night, the planes flew. The sky was full of hope. Children waved to the pilots. Mothers cried with relief. The Berlin airlift saved the city. But the message was clear. Europe was divided. The Iron Curtain was real. It was not going away. People wondered how long this division would last. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. In the West, people went to work. They shopped in markets. They danced and sang and hoped for a bright future. In the East, people watched and waited. They followed the rules. They stayed quiet. But inside, many dreamed of something better. Europe had become two worlds, two ways of life. And across the Iron Curtain, two superpowers watched each other with suspicion. The Cold War was growing stronger. Everyone wanted peace. But no one knew how to find it. People in the West looked east. People in the East looked west. And they all asked the same question. What comes next? Chapter 3. The Berlin Airlift. Berlin, 1948. The city was broken. Buildings were destroyed. Streets were covered in rubble. Families lived in the ruins of their old homes. The war was over, but its scars were everywhere. People wanted to rebuild. They wanted to move on. But Berlin was not like other cities. It was a symbol of power. Germany had been divided into 4 parts after the war. The United States, Britain, and France controlled the West. The Soviet Union controlled the East. Berlin, the capital, was deep inside the Soviet zone. But Berlin, too, was divided. The western part of the city belonged to the Allies, America, Britain, and France. The eastern part belonged to the Soviet Union. 2 sides, 2 worlds, and in the middle, a city full of people just trying to survive. At first, things were uneasy, but calm. People crossed from east to west without trouble. Families visited each other. Markets opened. Life was difficult, but it went on. But in 1948, everything changed. The United States and its allies wanted to help West Germany recover. They introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. It was a strong, reliable money to help the economy grow. But the Soviet Union did not like this. They saw it as a threat. They believed the West was trying to control all of Germany. Stalin, the Soviet leader, wanted to show his power. On June 24, 1948, the roads to West Berlin were closed. Trains were stopped. Trucks could not pass. "Nothing gets through," Stalin ordered. "No food, no coal, no supplies, nothing." The people of West Berlin were trapped. There was no way to leave, no way to get help. Food in the shops quickly ran out. Bread, milk, and eggs disappeared. People waited in long lines, hoping for something to eat. Winter was coming. Without coal, there would be no heat. People whispered to each other in fear. Why are they doing this? Will we starve? Will they let us freeze? Some said, maybe we should give up. Maybe we should let the Soviets take control. The Soviet Union had a plan. They wanted the people of West Berlin to suffer. They hoped the Allies would leave the city. If the Allies gave up, Berlin would belong to the Soviets. It would be a great victory. But the Allies would not give up. The leaders in America and Britain asked the same question. How can we help the people of Berlin? How can we stop Stalin? They had to act fast. If they did nothing, the people of West Berlin would die. Then, someone had an idea. We will fly supplies into the city. At first, it sounded crazy. How can planes bring enough food and coal for 2 million people? The generals asked. It's impossible. But the leaders said, we must try. The Berlin Airlift began. On June 26th, 2 American planes took off. They flew low over the city and landed at Tempelhof Airport. Inside, the planes were food, medicine, and fuel. People watched from the ground. They waved at the pilots. They could not believe it. Supplies were coming. The planes kept flying, every day, every night. More and more planes landed. Soon, British planes joined the Americans. The sound of engines filled the air. Children called them raisin bombers because the pilots sometimes dropped sweets from the sky. Little parachutes carried chocolate and raisins to the ground. Children laughed and ran to catch the treats. For a moment, they forgot their hunger. They forgot their fear. The airlift was dangerous. The airports were small. The runways were crowded. The planes flew through all kinds of weather: rain, snow, and fog. Sometimes the pilots could not see. It was dark, and the wind shook the planes. But they kept going. They knew people were counting on them. The Soviets watched. They were angry. They tried to stop the airlift. They sent planes to fly close to the American and British planes, trying to scare them. But the pilots were brave. They did not turn back. The planes kept coming. The people of West Berlin watched the skies. Mothers hugged their children close. Fathers looked up with hope. Every plane was a promise. We will not let you starve. We will not give up. Months passed. The Soviets thought the airlift would fail. They thought the Allies would grow tired. But they were wrong. The Allies brought more planes, bigger planes, faster planes. By the end of the summer, planes were landing every few minutes. Some pilots joked, "It's like a train station in the sky." Winter came. It was the coldest winter anyone could remember. Snow covered the streets of Berlin. People wrapped themselves in blankets. They huddled together for warmth. But the planes kept flying. Coal arrived every day. West Berlin stayed alive. In January 1949, something incredible happened. The airlift broke a record. In one day, over 5,000 tons of supplies were delivered. That was more food and fuel than trains could carry before the blockade. The Allies had done the impossible. The Soviet Union began to lose hope. The blockade was not working. The people of West Berlin were not giving up. The Allies were not leaving. Stalin had no choice. On May 12, 1949, the blockade ended. The roads were opened. Trains began to roll again. People cheered in the streets. They hugged their neighbors. They cried tears of joy. They had survived. The Berlin airlift lasted 11 months. During that time, planes made over 277,000 flights. They carried over 2 million tons of supplies. It was one of the greatest achievements of the Cold War. The airlift showed the world something important. It showed that freedom was worth fighting for. It showed that people could work together even in the hardest times. And it showed that hope could arrive, even from the sky. For the people of West Berlin, the sound of airplanes was no longer frightening. It was the sound of courage. It was the sound of friendship. It was the sound of survival. In the years that followed, Berlin remained a divided city. The Cold War continued, but the Berlin airlift had proved something powerful. The people of Berlin were not alone. And as children waved at the last planes flying over their city, they knew something else too. Sometimes heroes come with wings. Chapter 4. The Arms Race Begins. In August 1945, the world saw something it had never seen before. 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. The explosions were powerful, more powerful than anything ever created. Cities disappeared in seconds. Buildings turned to dust. The ground was burned. Thousands of lives were lost in an instant. The United States had the atomic bomb. It was a secret, a powerful secret. Many people believed this weapon had ended the Second World War. It also made the United States the strongest country in the world. No other country had such a weapon. People hoped it would keep the peace. "No one will dare start a war now," they said. "Not when one bomb can destroy everything." But not everyone felt safe. The Soviet Union was watching. They knew about the atomic bomb, and they wanted one too. Stalin, the Soviet leader, ordered his scientists to work faster. He wanted a bomb of his own. He wanted power. For years, Soviet scientists worked in secret. They tested ideas, they built machines, they made progress. Then, in 1949, it happened. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The explosion shook the earth. It was as powerful as the American bomb. The news spread quickly. The world gasped. People were shocked. How could this be? How could the Soviets build their own bomb so soon? In the United States, people felt afraid. They thought they were safe. Now, everything was different. Americans asked, what if the Soviets drop a bomb on us? What will happen to our cities? To our families? The government felt the same fear. Leaders in Washington, D.C. made an important decision. We need to build more bombs, they said. We need bigger bombs, stronger bombs. And so, the arms race began. The arms race was not a race like the Olympics. There were no runners or finish lines. It was a race for power, a race to see which country could build the most powerful weapons. The United States wanted to be stronger. The Soviet Union wanted the same. They both wanted to win. The scientists worked day and night. They built new bombs. They tested them underground. They tested them in deserts. Sometimes they tested them in the ocean. Each time a bomb exploded, the ground shook. A cloud of smoke rose high into the sky. These were not small explosions. These were massive, unimaginable. In 1952, the United States tested a new bomb. It was called the hydrogen bomb. It was even stronger than the atomic bomb. It could destroy everything within miles. People saw photos of the explosion. The fireball was huge. The smoke spread like a dark cloud. How can a bomb be so powerful? They asked. But the Soviet Union did not stop. In 1953, they tested their own hydrogen bomb. The race continued. The bombs grew bigger, more dangerous. Leaders on both sides said, "These bombs will keep us safe. If both sides have bombs, then no one will start a war. No one will dare." It was a strange idea. People called it mutually assured destruction. If one country attacked, the other country would attack back. Both countries would be destroyed. Everyone knew this. Still, the bombs were built. The numbers grew. By the 1960s, there were thousands of bombs, thousands of weapons that could end the world. Ordinary people felt this fear. It was not just a story on the news. It was real. People worried that one mistake could start a nuclear war. Leaders were careful with their words. A wrong move could mean disaster. In the United States, schools prepared for the worst. Teachers explained what to do if a bomb fell. When you hear the siren, they said, you must duck and cover. Students practiced hiding under their desks. They covered their heads with their hands. Stay low. Stay quiet. The teachers smiled to calm the children, but everyone knew the truth. A wooden desk could not protect them from a nuclear bomb. In cities, people built bomb shelters. These were rooms underground. Families filled them with food, water, and supplies. They hoped they would never need them. Posters appeared on walls. Be prepared, they said. Stay safe. But the fear did not go away. People watched the sky. They listened for the siren. They lived in quiet fear of the unthinkable. It was not just in the United States. The people in the Soviet Union also felt the tension. Their leaders told them, "The West wants to destroy us. We must be ready." Soviet families heard the same sirens. Children learned to hide under desks. Soldiers stood ready, day and night. The fear was everywhere. The arms race affected everyone. It changed science. It changed politics. It even changed the way people thought about the future. Writers wrote books about a world destroyed by bombs. Films showed cities turn to ash. Music and art reflected the fear. People wondered, will there be a future at all? But something else was happening too. Both sides wanted to show their strength in other ways. They looked to the sky. The arms race became the space race. Which country would reach the stars first? Which country would prove they were smarter? Faster? Stronger? The competition continued. Despite the fear, there was still hope. Some people believed the leaders would find a way to stop the race. They said, "We don't want war. No one wants this." In the United States and the Soviet Union, voices began to rise. People asked their leaders to slow down. They asked for peace. But the arms race did not stop. Not yet. Years passed. The weapons grew more powerful. The numbers grew larger. But the truth remained the same. No one wanted to use the bombs. No one wanted to start the war. The arms race was a strange kind of war. There were no battles, no soldiers in trenches, no cities destroyed. But the danger was always there. One mistake, one wrong move, one moment of anger, and everything could end. For now, both sides watched each other. They tested their weapons. They counted their bombs. And they waited. In homes across the world, parents hugged their children close. Teachers smiled and said, "It's just a drill. Don't worry." But everyone worried. Everyone hoped. Everyone asked the same question. Will it ever stop? No one knew the answer. The arms race had begun, and there was no turning back. The world was holding its breath. Chapter 5. The Korean War. In 1950, a small country in Asia became the center of a global conflict. That country was Korea. It was divided, just like Germany, just like Europe. In the north, the government was communist, supported by the Soviet Union and China. In the south, the government was non-communist, supported by the United States and the West. At the end of World War II, The Allies had split Korea at the 38th parallel, an invisible line across the middle of the country. The North became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The South became the Republic of Korea. Two governments, two leaders, and two very different ideas. The people hoped for peace, but the two sides wanted control. Tension grew every year. Leaders in the North believed Korea should be united, under communism. Leaders in the South wanted to stay free. They were like two sides of a broken mirror, each side reflecting something different. On June 25th, 1950, everything changed. Early in the morning, soldiers from North Korea crossed the 38th parallel, thousands of them. Tanks rolled over the hills, guns fired. The North Korean army moved fast, attacking cities and villages in the south. It was a surprise attack. People ran for their lives. "War has begun," they whispered in fear. The North wanted to take the whole country. They wanted control, and nothing would stop them. South Korean soldiers fought back, but they were not strong enough. The North's army pushed them further south, closer to the sea. It seemed the South would fall. The news spread quickly. The world watched as Korea burned. The United States was worried. President Truman said, "We must stop communism. If we do nothing, it will spread to other countries." He believed the attack on South Korea was a test of the United States' strength. The United Nations agreed to act. For the first time, countries from around the world joined together to fight a war. The United States led the effort. Soldiers came from America, Britain, Canada, Australia, and other nations. They would defend South Korea. The fighting was brutal. The soldiers faced thick jungles, steep mountains, and burning heat. In the towns, families hid in their homes, praying to survive. In the fields, soldiers ran through gunfire and explosions. The smell of smoke filled the air. In September 1950, the United States launched a bold attack. General Douglas MacArthur, the leader of the U.S. forces, planned a landing at the city of Incheon behind the North Korean army. It was risky. If they failed, thousands of soldiers could die. But the plan worked. U.S. and South Korean forces pushed the North Korean army back across the 38th parallel. For a moment, it seemed the war might end. The South was saved. But then, something unexpected happened. China entered the war. The Chinese government had warned the United States not to cross the 38th parallel. "Do not come closer to our border," they said. But the U.S. and its allies kept moving north. They wanted to unite all of Korea under a free government. China could not allow that to happen. In October 1950, Chinese soldiers crossed the border into Korea. Thousands and thousands of them. They joined the North Korean army and pushed the U.S. and South Korean forces back. The fighting grew worse. The winters in Korea were freezing. Snow covered the ground. Soldiers' hands turned blue from the cold. In the dark nights, the sound of gunfire echoed through the valleys. The war became a stalemate. Neither side could win. Cities were destroyed. Villages turned to ashes. The people of Korea suffered the most. Homes were lost. Families were separated. Mothers searched for their children. Fathers tried to find food. A Korean boy named Ji-hoon sat in a small shelter with his family. The roof was broken and the wind blew in. His mother held his sister close. "When will this end?" Ji-hoon asked. His father didn't answer. He looked at the ground, silent. A U.S. soldier named Tom wrote a letter to his family back home. "The days are long here. The nights are worse. I miss the sun. I miss peace. I don't understand why we are here, but I know we must fight." The war continued for 3 long years. Both sides suffered great losses. Thousands of soldiers died. Thousands of innocent people died too. And in the end, nothing changed. On July 27, 1953, an agreement was signed. The fighting stopped. But there was no winner. The 38th parallel remained. The North and South were still divided. The war had solved nothing. For the people of Korea, the pain was not over. Families that had been separated by the war could not see each other again. Brothers and sisters lived on opposite sides of the border, not knowing if they would ever meet. In North Korea, the government grew stronger. It became one of the most controlled countries in the world. People could not speak freely. They could not leave. They were told the North won the war. They were told that communism had saved them. In South Korea, life was different. With help from the United States and other countries, South Korea began to rebuild. It was not easy. The war had destroyed much of the land. But the people worked hard. They wanted a better future. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War. Many people in the world do not remember it. But for the Korean people, it was not forgotten. It changed their lives forever. It turned their country into 2 worlds, 2 nations. Even today, the border between North and South Korea remains. Soldiers stand on both sides. They watch each other. They wait. The war is not over. Not really. There was no peace, only a pause. For the rest of the world, the Korean War showed something important. It showed how far the United States and its allies would go to stop communism. It showed that the Cold War was real and dangerous. And as the people of Korea looked across the border, they wondered the same thing they wondered years before. When will this end? No one knew the answer. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now let's continue the story. Chapter 6: Spies and Secrets. The Cold War was not like other wars. There were no giant battles with tanks and soldiers. There were no clear winners or losers. Instead, it was a war of secrets, a war of spies, a war where information was as powerful as bombs. The United States and the Soviet Union were enemies, but they did not fight face to face. Instead, they sent spies to learn each other's secrets. The U.S. had the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. The Soviet Union had the KGB, the Committee for State Security. These two groups became the eyes and ears of their countries. The spies were everywhere. In crowded cities, in quiet towns, in dark alleyways, men in long coats and hats moved quickly through the streets. They carried secret papers hidden inside newspapers. They whispered in dark cafes. They changed their names, their clothes, their voices. Sometimes they even changed their faces with wigs and fake mustaches. It was dangerous work. If a spy was caught, they could spend the rest of their life in prison. Or worse. But the rewards were high. A single secret could change everything. It could give one side the advantage in this silent war. In Moscow, the Soviet Union's capital, people whispered in the streets, "Is that man a spy? Is my neighbor working for the West?" People were afraid to trust anyone. In some families, even children were taught to watch their parents. "Be careful what you say," their teachers warned. Enemies are everywhere. In Washington, D.C., the U.S. government was worried too. They believed Soviet spies were working in America. Important papers might be stolen. Secrets might be sold. People in the United States started to fear their own neighbors. "Is he a communist?" they asked. "Is she working for the Soviets?" The hunt for spies began. It became known as the Red Scare. In schools, in offices, and in homes, people were questioned. "Do you believe in communism?" they were asked. "Are you loyal to America?" Some people were arrested. Others lost their jobs. Some were not spies at all. But the fear was real. Spying was not just about stealing papers or whispering secrets. It was also about technology. Both sides wanted to listen. They placed hidden microphones in walls and furniture. In the Soviet Union, hotel rooms for foreigners were filled with bugs, small devices that could listen to conversations. If you spoke too loudly, someone might hear you. If you said the wrong thing, someone might knock on your door. In the skies, new kinds of spying began. The United States sent planes called U-2s to fly over the Soviet Union. These planes flew high, so high that no one could see them. Cameras on the planes took pictures of secret Soviet buildings and military bases. The Americans believed the planes were safe. "The Soviets will never catch us," they said. But in 1960, the impossible happened. A U-2 plane was shot down over Soviet territory. The pilot, Gary Powers, was captured. The world watched as the Soviets showed pieces of the broken plane. They showed the pilot on television. The United States had been caught. It was embarrassing. The Soviets celebrated their victory. The silent war had turned noisy. In other parts of the world, spies worked in shadows. They sent messages in code. They wrote secret letters using invisible ink. A blank piece of paper could hold the most important plans. At night, spies met in hidden places. They exchanged tiny boxes filled with microfilms, small pictures of documents. Sometimes they left these packages under benches in parks or inside trees. The KGB was especially skilled at finding enemies. If someone spoke against the Soviet Union, the KGB would find them. People disappeared in the middle of the night. Their families never saw them again. Fear became a way of life. People learned to speak softly, to look over their shoulder, to trust no one. In the United States, the CIA was busy too. They worked to stop the spread of communism. They helped governments that supported the West. In some countries, they removed leaders they believed were too close to the Soviets. The CIA was secretive. Most people did not know what they were doing. They only saw the results. Some spies became famous. One of the most dangerous was Kim Philby. He was a British spy who worked for the Soviet Union for many years. The British trusted him completely. They shared secrets with him. But all the while, Philby was passing those secrets to the KGB. When the truth came out, it shocked the world. How could we trust him? People asked. How many secrets did he give away? There were also double agents, spies who worked for both sides. They were the most dangerous of all. No one knew where their loyalty truly lay. They played a risky game, and one mistake could cost them everything. In cities across the world, ordinary people felt the tension. In Berlin, a man might disappear after meeting with someone in a cafe. In London, a package might arrive with no name. In New York, a stranger might follow you down the street. The world felt like a puzzle. Who was a spy? Who was a friend? Who could you trust? The Cold War was fought in shadows, with secrets instead of soldiers. It was a battle of minds, of lies, and of loyalty. Each side wanted to know what the other was doing. Each side wanted to know what the other was thinking. Leaders in Washington and Moscow watched closely. One secret could be the key to victory or defeat. In the end, the spies and the secrets shaped the Cold War. They helped build weapons. They helped plan battles. They created fear and distrust. But they also kept the world balanced. Neither side wanted to start a war without knowing what the other side could do. And so, the spies kept working. The secrets kept spreading. And the world held its breath, wondering what would happen next. People learned to be careful with their words, to watch their steps, to whisper instead of shout. They knew the truth. In the Cold War, you never knew who was listening. Chapter 7. The Space Race. In October 1957, the world looked up to the sky in shock. News spread across countries, across oceans, across families sitting in their homes. Sputnik has launched. The Soviet Union had done something no one thought possible. They had sent the first satellite into space. It was small, only about the size of a beach ball, but it was powerful. Sputnik 1 moved high above the Earth, circling the planet. It made a quiet beep, beep, beep as it flew. The sound could be heard on radios. People stopped and listened. The world was amazed and afraid. In the United States, newspapers printed the story in bold letters, "The Soviets are in space." Some people looked up at the night sky, wondering. "Can they see us?" they asked. "What are they planning?" To many Americans, Sputnik was not just a satellite. It was proof. Proof that the Soviet Union was winning the race to space. The Cold War had already created a race for bombs and weapons. But now, there was a new race, a race to the stars, and it had begun. The United States could not fall behind. Scientists, engineers, and politicians felt the pressure. "We must catch up," they said. They built their own rockets, hoping to send something into space. But their first attempts failed. Rockets exploded. Satellites crashed. It was embarrassing. People started to worry. Are the Soviets smarter than us? While the U.S. struggled, the Soviet Union moved forward. They had a new plan, something even bigger than Sputnik. They wanted to send a person into space. On April 12, 1961, they did it. A Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, became the first human to travel to space. He sat in a small capsule called Vostok 1. It was not much bigger than a car. The rocket engines roared as it launched into the sky. Gagarin's heart raced, but his voice was calm. "Poyakali," he said, "let's go." The rocket climbed higher and higher. Then, for the first time in history, a human saw the Earth from space. It was beautiful, blue, round, quiet. Gagarin looked out the window and said, "The Earth is blue." He spent just 108 minutes in space. Then, his capsule returned to Earth. Gagarin landed safely. He was a hero. The Soviet Union celebrated. Their flag flew high, and Gagarin's face appeared on posters, stamps, and newspapers. People cheered his name in the streets. "We are first," the Soviets said. In the United States, the news hit hard. Yuri Gagarin's flight was a success, and America felt behind again. President John F. Kennedy knew something had to change. He stood in front of Congress and made a promise. His voice was strong and clear. "We choose to go to the moon," he said. "We will land a man on the moon and bring him back safely. We will do this before the decade is over." The goal was set. The race was on. American scientists and engineers worked day and night. They built rockets. They tested capsules. They made plans. The U.S. created a program called NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Thousands of people worked together, all with one mission: to win the space race. The first challenge was simple but dangerous: send an American into space. In 1961, just weeks after Yuri Gagarin's flight, an American astronaut named Alan Shepard became the first American in space. His flight was short, only 15 minutes, but it was a victory. The United States was catching up. Over the next few years, both countries pushed harder. They built bigger rockets and better technology. The Soviets sent the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space in 1963. The Americans launched new missions, practicing how to orbit the Earth. Both sides were determined. Both wanted to win. But the moon was the prize. In 1966, the United States started the Apollo program. It was the most ambitious space program in history. Scientists had to solve impossible problems. How do we land on the moon? How do we bring the astronauts home? Engineers built new rockets. Astronauts trained for hours every day. Then, on July 16, 1969, it was time. A giant rocket called Saturn V stood on a launch pad in Florida. Inside was a spacecraft called Apollo 11. 3 astronauts sat inside: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The world watched and waited. The engines started to roar. Smoke filled the air. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The rocket lifted off the ground. Fire and noise shook the earth as it climbed into the sky. People cheered. Some cried. Others held their breath. Apollo 11 traveled for 4 days to reach the moon. Michael Collins stayed in the main spacecraft, orbiting the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into a smaller ship called the Eagle. It was time to land. Slowly, the Eagle moved toward the surface of the moon. Armstrong looked out the window. "The ground is rough," he said. They had to be careful. Too fast, and they could crash. Finally, Armstrong's voice came through the radio. "The Eagle has landed." It was July the 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong opened the door of the Eagle and climbed down the ladder. His boots touched the moon's surface. It was quiet, still. Then Armstrong spoke the famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Millions of people watched from Earth. They saw Armstrong and Aldrin walk on the moon. They saw the American flag standing in the gray dust. It was a moment of wonder, a moment of history. The United States had done it. They had won the race to the moon. But the space race was about more than winning. It showed what people could do when they worked together. It showed how far human courage and science could take us. The Soviet Union had started the race with Sputnik. They sent the first human into space, but the United States reached the moon first. Both sides had successes. Both had failures. But in the end, the space race inspired the world. After Apollo 11, the Cold War continued, but something had changed. People looked at the stars with new eyes. They imagined futures full of possibilities. Space was no longer just for countries fighting each other. Space was for everyone. And as the astronauts looked back at the Earth from the moon, they saw something beautiful. A small blue planet, alone in the darkness. For a moment, there were no borders, no sides, just one world. The race to the stars had shown us something important. Even in a time of fear and competition, humans could reach for the impossible and succeed. Chapter 8. The Berlin Wall. After World War II, Berlin became a city divided. The West belonged to the United States, Britain, and France. The East belonged to the Soviet Union. 2 sides, 2 worlds. In West Berlin, life was full of energy and hope. People worked, traveled, and spoke freely. Shops were full of goods. New buildings rose where old ones had been destroyed. It was not always easy, but it felt free. In East Berlin, life was different. The Soviet Union controlled everything. The government decided where people could work, what they could say, and what they could buy. Shops were often empty. Families stood in long lines for bread, milk, and meat. There were no choices, only rules. The people of East Berlin could see what life was like in the West. Sometimes they could cross into West Berlin to visit family or friends. They saw cars, clothes, and food that they could not have. They listened to music that was banned in the East. They felt freedom in the air. And many began to dream. What if we lived here? What if we never went back? The leaders of East Germany and the Soviet Union were worried. Every year, thousands of people left East Berlin. Doctors, teachers, engineers, people the government needed. They crossed into West Berlin and never returned. It was like a leak in a boat, and the leaders didn't know how to stop it. By 1961, the problem had grown too big to ignore. The East German leader, Walter Ulbricht, made a decision. "We will close the border," he said. "We will stop people from leaving." No one knew what was coming. On the night of August 12, 1961, East German soldiers received orders. In the dark, they moved quickly. Trucks arrived. Men carried bricks, barbed wire, and tools. The streets were silent. People were asleep. No one noticed. By morning, everything had changed. A fence of barbed wire stretched across the city. It cut streets in half. It split neighborhoods. It divided families. People woke up and ran to their windows. They could not believe their eyes. "What is happening?" they asked. Soldiers stood guard, ready with guns. The barbed wire fence was just the beginning. Soon, workers began building a wall. A real wall made of stone and concrete. It grew taller each day. It grew stronger. The wall ran for over 155 kilometers. It circled West Berlin like a prison. People were trapped. Some families lived on one side of the wall. Their relatives lived on the other. A father in West Berlin could not visit his daughter in the East. A sister in the East could not hug her brother in the West. People stood on either side of the wall, waving to loved ones they could no longer reach. Tears fell. Voices called out. But the wall did not move. The guards were strict. If someone tried to escape, they were shot. The orders were clear. No one crosses the wall. For many, the dream of freedom was now impossible. The wall became a symbol of division, of fear, of lost dreams. But some people did not give up. They wanted freedom, no matter the risk. They tried to escape in secret. They dug tunnels under the wall. They hid in cars. They jumped from buildings close to the wall. Some swam through icy rivers. Others used fake passports. There were stories of hope and stories of tragedy. A young man named Peter tried to climb the wall. His family waited on the other side, shouting his name. The guards saw him and fired their guns. Peter fell. His family cried out, but no one could help him. He lay there, close to freedom but too far to reach it. His story became famous. It showed the world the pain the wall caused. In West Berlin, people protested. They shouted, "Tear down the wall!" They painted the wall with bright colors, words of hope, and pictures of peace. But in East Berlin, the wall was gray and empty. Soldiers watched every movement. People stayed silent. They learned to live with the wall, but they never accepted it. Years passed. The wall stood tall, a constant reminder of the division between East and West. Leaders spoke about peace, but the wall did not change. People in East Berlin lived under the watchful eyes of the government. They whispered their dreams quietly, afraid someone might hear them. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin. He stood in front of a crowd of thousands. His voice was strong as he spoke. "Ich bin ein Berliner," he said. "I am a Berliner." The people cheered. His words gave them hope. The world was watching Berlin. The wall would not be forgotten. For almost 30 years, the Berlin Wall stood. It separated families. It divided a city. It broke hearts. But walls cannot stop hope. People in East Berlin dreamed of freedom. They whispered about change. They imagined a day when the wall would fall. And though no one knew it then, that day would come. The Berlin Wall was a symbol of fear, but it was also a symbol of something stronger, people's desire to be free. No wall could take that away. And as people on both sides of Berlin looked at the wall, they knew one truth. Walls may be strong, but dreams are stronger. Chapter 9. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world came closer to war than ever before. It began quietly. No one knew what was happening, but soon the truth would shock everyone. Cuba, a small island country in the Caribbean Sea, was only 90 miles from the United States. For many years, Cuba and the U.S. had been close. But in 1959, everything changed. A man named Fidel Castro took power in Cuba. Castro was a communist. He wanted Cuba to follow the ideas of the Soviet Union. The United States was worried. "We cannot have communism so close to our borders," leaders said. Relations with Cuba broke down. The U.S. stopped trade with the island. They hoped Castro would fail. But Cuba grew closer to the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union began to act in secret. They made a dangerous plan. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev wanted to send nuclear missiles to Cuba. Why? To protect Cuba from the United States. To show Soviet power. And most of all, to strike fear. The missiles would be close. Too close. If war began, they could hit American cities in minutes. The U.S. would have no time to react. The Soviets started shipping the missiles to Cuba. Large ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean. On board were missiles, launchers, and equipment. In Cuba, workers began building launch sites. They worked at night, hiding everything during the day. The Soviets wanted no one to see. But they were wrong. In October 1962, American spy planes flew high above Cuba. From the sky, cameras took pictures. The photos showed something shocking: nuclear missile launch sites under construction. The Soviets had placed missiles on Cuba. President John F. Kennedy looked at the photos in silence. His advisors stood around him. No one spoke. Finally, Kennedy asked, "What do we do?" The United States had to act. But how? If they attacked Cuba, it could start a war. If they did nothing, the missiles would soon be ready to launch. There was no easy answer. Kennedy decided to speak to the American people. On the evening of October 22nd, televisions and radios across the United States went silent. Families sat together, waiting. President Kennedy appeared on the screen. His face was serious. His voice was calm, but strong. "Good evening, my fellow citizens," he began. He explained the situation. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles were a direct threat to the United States. Kennedy made an announcement. The U.S. Navy would create a blockade around Cuba. No more Soviet ships could bring weapons to the island. "We will not allow this threat," Kennedy said. "We will protect our country and the world from danger." The message was clear. The next day, American warships moved into position around Cuba. The blockade began. The world watched in silence. What would the Soviet Union do? Would they stop, or would they fight? In Moscow, Khrushchev received Kennedy's message. He was angry. He did not want to back down. He sent a letter to Kennedy. "Your actions are an act of war," it said, but the United States stayed firm. "Turn your ships around," Kennedy replied. The days passed slowly. People held their breath. In Cuba, workers continued to build the missile sites. Soviet soldiers were ready. In the United States, children practiced duck and cover drills in school. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. They filled them with food, water, and blankets. No one knew what would happen. At sea, Soviet ships moved closer to the American blockade. U.S. sailors stood on deck, watching through binoculars. They saw the Soviet ships on the horizon. Closer, closer. Would they stop, or would they try to pass? For hours, nothing happened. The world waited. Then, the Soviet ships slowed. One by one, they turned back. They did not cross the blockade. A small sign of hope, but the crisis was not over. In Washington, Kennedy and his advisors received a new message from Khrushchev. It was softer this time. "If you promise not to invade Cuba," he wrote, "we will remove the missiles." The message brought relief. But before Kennedy could answer, another message arrived. This one was stronger. "If you do not remove your blockade," it said, "there will be war." The tension grew worse. Kennedy had to decide. His advisors argued. "We must attack," some said. "No," others argued. "War will destroy us all." Finally, Kennedy sent his reply. He chose peace. "We promise not to invade Cuba," he wrote, "if the missiles are removed." Secretly, He also promised to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. This was a private agreement, not shared with the world. The next day, on October 28, 1962, Khrushchev gave his answer. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world let out a deep breath. In Cuba, the workers stopped building the missile sites. Soviet ships returned to Moscow, carrying the missiles back with them. The American blockade ended. War had been avoided, but just barely. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted only 13 days, but those 13 days felt like forever. The world had stood on the edge of disaster. For the first time, people understood how close a nuclear war could be. In the weeks after the crisis, leaders on both sides realized something important. The world could not survive another moment like this. The United States and the Soviet Union began to talk. They agreed to be more careful. They set up a hotline, a direct telephone line between Moscow and Washington. If another crisis happened, the leaders could speak to each other quickly. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War. It showed the danger of nuclear weapons. It showed how close the world could come to destruction. But it also showed something hopeful. Even in the most dangerous moments, leaders could choose peace. For the people who lived through it, the fear was unforgettable. Mothers held their children close. Fathers looked up at the sky, waiting. Children listened to sirens and wondered, "Is this the end?" But the end never came. The ships turned back. The missiles were removed. And for now, the world was safe again. 10. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War began quietly, but it grew into one of the most painful conflicts of the Cold War. It was a war in a faraway land, a place of jungles, rivers, and mountains, yet it would affect millions of people around the world. Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia, had been divided after World War II. In the north, the government was communist, led by Ho Chi Minh. In the south, the government was supported by the United States and other Western countries. The two sides wanted very different things. The leaders of North Vietnam wanted to unite the country under communism. "We will fight for our freedom," they said. The South wanted to stop them, but the government in the South was weak and struggled to lead. The United States watched Vietnam closely. To American leaders, communism was a threat. They believed if Vietnam became communist, other countries in Asia would follow. "If we don't stop communism here," they said, "it will spread like a disease." At first, the U.S. sent only weapons, money, and military advisors to South Vietnam. But the North grew stronger. Groups in South Vietnam, called the Viet Cong, fought for the North. They used surprise attacks, hiding in the thick jungles and striking quickly. The U.S. soon realized they had to do more. In 1965, American troops arrived in Vietnam. Young soldiers, many only 18 or 19 years old, were sent to fight in a place they had never heard of before. They carried heavy packs and rifles through muddy fields, dense jungles, and rivers. The war in Vietnam was different from other wars. There were no big battles. The enemy was hard to see. The Viet Cong did not wear uniforms. They blended into villages and forests. They dug tunnels underground where they could hide and plan attacks. The U.S. soldiers called the jungle the Green Hell. It was hot, wet, and full of dangers, poisonous snakes, insects, and traps set by the enemy. The fighting was brutal. The soldiers walked for days, unsure of where the enemy was. Then suddenly, gunfire, explosions, confusion. The jungle came alive, and soldiers had to fight to survive. Back home in the United States, families watched the war on television. It was the first war people could see every night on the news. They saw soldiers covered in mud. They saw villages burning. They saw wounded men carried on stretchers. At first, many Americans believed the war was necessary. "We must stop communism," the leaders said. But as the years passed, more and more people began to ask questions. Why are we fighting? Why are so many young men dying? Is this war worth it? The soldiers asked the same questions. They were far from home, surrounded by danger. Some of them did not understand the people they were fighting for. A young soldier named Tom wrote in his journal, "I don't know why we're here. The people don't seem to want us. The jungle is endless. I just want to go home." In Vietnam, ordinary people suffered the most. Villages were destroyed. Families lost their homes. Farmers were caught between two sides. In the middle of the war, they just wanted to survive. Children looked at the sky, scared of planes that dropped bombs. Mothers cried for their sons, who never came home. The war divided America. Young people began to protest. College students marched in the streets carrying signs that said, "End the war and bring our soldiers home." They sang songs of peace. They said the war was wrong. "Why are we killing people in Vietnam?" they asked. The protests grew louder as the war continued. Some soldiers returned home, but they were not welcomed as heroes. People blamed them for the war. The soldiers felt forgotten. They carried the memories of the jungle with them. The sounds of explosions. The faces of lost friends. These memories stayed with them forever. In 1968, the war became even more painful. On the night of January 30th, during a holiday called Tet, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched a huge surprise attack. They attacked cities, military bases, and villages across South Vietnam. The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces fought back, but the damage was done. People in America watched the news and said, "This war will never end." Leaders in the United States began to realize they could not win. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters would not give up. They knew the land. They knew the jungle. They had been fighting for years, and they would keep fighting until they won. By the early 1970s, American leaders began to pull soldiers out of Vietnam. The war was too long, too painful, too unpopular. In 1973, the United States signed a peace agreement. The soldiers went home. The fighting stopped for a while. But the war was not over for Vietnam. The North continued to fight. In 1975, they won. The city of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell. North and South Vietnam were united under communism. The Vietnam War was over, but its effects did not end. More than 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese people lost their lives. The jungles were burned. Villages were empty. Families were broken. In the United States, the war left deep scars. People questioned their leaders. They no longer trusted the government as they once had. Soldiers came home with wounds, some on their bodies, some in their hearts. They struggled to find peace. For the Vietnamese people, the war changed their country forever. Cities were rebuilt. Fields were farmed again. But the memories of war remained. The Vietnam War became a symbol of confusion and pain. It showed the world that war is not always clear. There are no easy answers. There is no real winner. And as soldiers stood in the quiet jungles years later, they could still hear the echoes of the past, the sounds of guns, the cries for help, and the questions that would never be answered. Why were we here, and what did it all mean? Chapter 11. The Fall of the Berlin Wall. For nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall stood tall. It divided a city. It separated families. It became a symbol of fear, of control, and of the Cold War itself. On one side of the wall was West Berlin. People there lived freely. They worked, traveled, and spoke without fear. Shops were full of food and clothes. Music played in cafes. Life was full of hope. On the other side was East Berlin. Life was harder. The government controlled everything. People could not speak freely. There were no choices. They could not leave the East to see family or friends in the West. Guards stood at the wall with guns. Watchtowers rose high, and barbed wire stretched across the city. For decades, the wall was unbreakable. It seemed like it would stand forever. But by the 1980s, something was changing. The Soviet Union was growing weaker. Its economy was failing. Its power over Eastern Europe was no longer so strong. People in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia began to demand freedom. They marched in the streets, shouting for change. In East Germany, people were watching. They saw what was happening in other countries. They heard stories of hope. If they can have freedom, they said, why can't we? By 1989, the pressure was too strong to ignore. More and more East Germans protested. They gathered in large groups. They carried signs that said, "We want freedom," and "We want to travel." The government was worried. The protests grew larger each day. The people did not stop. They marched through the streets of East Berlin. They shouted for change. The sound of their voices was loud and clear. "No more walls," they cried. "No more fear." The East German government tried to control them. They made speeches. They promised small changes. But it was too late. The people wanted more than promises. They wanted freedom. In November 1989, the world held its breath. The protests reached their peak. Crowds filled the streets, chanting and waving their fists. The government could not stop them. The pressure was too great. Then, on November 9th, something unexpected happened. A government official made an announcement on television. His words were unclear, but people heard what they wanted to hear. He said that East Germans could now cross the border into West Berlin. The news spread like fire. People could not believe it. "Is it true?" they asked. "Can we cross the wall?" That night, thousands of East Germans rushed to the wall. They gathered at the checkpoints. Soldiers stood there, confused. The orders were unclear. "What should we do?" they asked their commanders. The crowds grew larger. People shouted, "Let us through!" Finally, the guard stepped back. The gates opened. The people began to cross. East Berliners stepped into West Berlin for the first time in decades. Some cried, some laughed, some hugged strangers. The streets filled with cheers. People climbed on top of the wall, waving flags and singing songs of freedom. In the West, people welcomed them with open arms. Families reunited after years of separation. Friends hugged each other tightly. Tears ran down their faces. For so long, the wall had kept them apart. But now, it was just a wall of stone and cement. It had no power anymore. People brought hammers and chisels. They began to break pieces off the wall. The sound of stone breaking filled the air. "Take it down," they shouted. "Take it all down." Some people took small pieces home as a memory. Others simply watched, unable to believe what they were seeing. In the days that followed, the wall began to fall. Slowly, piece by piece, it came down. News spread across the world. Newspapers printed headlines in bold letters. "The Berlin Wall has fallen." Television screens showed images of people cheering, dancing, and celebrating. For the people of Berlin, it was a moment of joy. For years, the wall had been a symbol of division. Now, it was gone. The city was united. East and West were one again. The fall of the wall was more than just the end of a barrier. It was the end of an era. The Cold War, which had divided the world for so long, was coming to an end. People everywhere felt hope. They believed that peace was possible. In East Germany, people looked forward to new opportunities. They could now travel, vote, and live without fear. In the West, people welcomed them. The two sides of the city were no longer enemies. They were neighbors. They were friends. Leaders from around the world spoke of the wall's fall as a great victory for freedom. U.S. President Ronald Reagan had once said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, his words had come true. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had allowed change to happen. He knew the time for walls and division was over. For young people who grew up in East Berlin, it was a new beginning. A boy named Lucas crossed the wall with his family. He looked around in wonder. "Everything is so bright here," he said. "Everything feels free." An older woman named Marta stood on the broken wall, holding her granddaughter's hand. "I never thought I would see this day," she whispered. Her voice was full of emotion. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked a turning point in history. It was proof that walls, no matter how strong, cannot keep people apart forever. It was a reminder that hope can break even the strongest barriers. In the years that followed, Berlin changed. The city grew into a place of unity and progress. The pieces of the wall were taken away. Some were placed in museums to remind people of what had once been. The Cold War was ending, and the world was changing. Old enemies became partners. Countries that had been divided began to work together. People believed in a better future. On that cold November night in 1989, the people of Berlin proved something powerful. Freedom cannot be stopped. Walls can fall, and when people stand together, they can change the world. The Berlin Wall was gone, but its memory remained. It would always remind the world of one important truth. No wall can stand forever against the power of hope and unity. 12. The end of the Cold War. For nearly 50 years, the Cold War shaped the world. It was a war of fear, of competition, of secrets. The United States and the Soviet Union stood against each other, watching, waiting. They built weapons. They raced to space. They divided countries and people. For decades, it felt as though the Cold War would never end. But by the 1980s, everything began to change. The Soviet Union was growing weaker. Its economy was broken. Factories produced too little. Shops were often empty. People waited in long lines for bread and meat. Many families had nothing to eat. Life in the Soviet Union was hard, and people wanted something better. At the same time, new leaders were rising. In 1985, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. He was different. Gorbachev saw that things could not continue as they were. "We need change," he said. He introduced two new ideas: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost meant openness. For the first time, Soviet people could speak more freely. Newspapers wrote about problems in the country. People could share their opinions without fear. It was something new. For many, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Perestroika meant restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to fix the Soviet economy. He wanted businesses to work better and produce more. He also wanted to improve relationships with the West. He believed that the Cold War needed to end. But change is not easy. Gorbachev's ideas gave people hope, but they also created problems. In the Soviet Union's 15 republics, people began to demand independence. Countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia wanted to be free. They were tired of Soviet control. They wanted to choose their own leaders and decide their own future. At the same time, the Cold War was ending across Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia had been controlled by communist governments for years. But by the late 1980s, everything was changing. People were marching in the streets. They were demanding freedom. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It was a powerful symbol. The wall had divided East and West for almost 30 years. Now, It was gone. East Germans could finally cross into West Germany. Families were reunited. Friends hugged each other with tears in their eyes. The world was watching. The Cold War was beginning to crumble. In the Soviet Union, people saw what was happening in other countries. They wanted freedom too. Protests broke out in cities across the republics. People waved their national flags. They shouted for independence. Gorbachev tried to keep the country together, but the Soviet Union was falling apart. By 1991, it was clear that the end had come. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television. His face was calm but sad. "I resign as president of the Soviet Union," he said. The Soviet flag, with its red background and gold hammer and sickle, was taken down. In its place, a new flag flew, Russia's white, blue, and red. The Soviet Union was gone. It was a historic moment. After nearly 50 years, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union split into 15 independent countries. Russia was the largest of them all. The other countries, like Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, began to build their own futures. For the United States, it was a victory. The Cold War had ended without a nuclear disaster. But it was not a simple ending. The world was not the same. New challenges had begun. In Russia, life was difficult. The economy struggled. Factories closed, and people lost their jobs. Prices rose, and families could not afford basic things. Some people were hopeful about their new freedom. Others felt lost. They missed the old days when life, though hard, was more predictable. In the United States, people celebrated the end of the Cold War. There were no more duck and cover drills. The fear of nuclear war began to fade. But there were still questions. What would happen to the world now? Would the United States remain the most powerful country? Would Russia rise again? Across Eastern Europe, people were rebuilding. Countries that had been under Soviet control now had new governments. They held elections. People voted freely for the first time in years. In Poland, Hungary, and other nations, people worked to create better lives. They knew it would not be easy, but they believed it was possible. The end of the Cold War brought new opportunities, but also new problems. Old conflicts returned. New leaders rose to power. The world was changing fast. Countries that had been enemies now worked together. Others began to compete in new ways. For the people who lived through the Cold War, the memories stayed with them. They remembered the fear. They remembered the arms race, the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. They remembered how close the world had come to disaster. A woman named Anna, who grew up in East Germany, stood by a piece of the fallen Berlin Wall. Her voice was quiet as she spoke. "I thought the wall would stand forever," she said. "But it didn't. Nothing can stand against people's desire for freedom." A man named Victor in Russia remembered the old Soviet days. "We had little," he said, "but we were strong. Now we are free, but life is harder. Freedom comes with a price." The Cold War was over, but its lessons remained. It had shown the world the dangers of division. It had shown the power of fear, of weapons, of secrets. But it had also shown something hopeful, the power of people to demand change. When the Soviet Union fell, the world breathed a sigh of relief. The shadow of nuclear war was lifting, the arms race was ending, and countries that had been divided for so long could look to the future with hope. In schools, children learned about the Cold War as history. They learned about leaders like John F. Kennedy, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Ronald Reagan. They read about the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the space race. And as they listened, they understood something important. The Cold War had not been a war of battles. It had been a war of ideas, a war of fear and hope. It had shown the world how close humans could come to destroying themselves, and how strong they could be when they chose peace instead. In the end, the Cold War ended not with bombs, but with change. The Soviet Union fell. The world moved forward. And as people looked back at those 50 years of tension, they remembered how fragile peace could be. They remembered the walls that fell, the voices that rose, and the moments when disaster was avoided. The Cold War was over, but its story would never be forgotten.